There are moments in a person's life that arrive without warning and quietly rearrange everything that comes after them, and for Danielle Reyes, that moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in the one place she had always believed was completely and permanently her own. She had come home from a long day of appraisals, had barely set her keys down on the counter, when a knock at the door turned into something far heavier than a simple visit. Danielle Reyes stood in the middle of her own living room, the one she had paid for in full with her own money, and listened to her mother tell her she had 1 week to sign it away. Gerald Whitfield stood beside Carol Reyes Whitfield with his arms crossed, the posture of a man who had already decided the outcome of a conversation before it started. The apartment around them, the one Danielle had worked 12 years to earn, suddenly felt like a courtroom, and she was the only one on trial. Carol's voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as she explained that Vanessa was pregnant now, that the baby would need a real home, and that family was supposed to mean something. Danielle didn't answer right away, she let the silence sit in the room like a held breath, and for the first time in years, her mother looked uncertain. What Carol and Gerald did not know, standing in that living room issuing their ultimatum, was that Danielle had already made her decision days before they ever showed up. It wasn't the decision they expected, and it wasn't a decision either of them was prepared to hear. Danielle's face didn't move, she didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for anger the way Gerald clearly wanted her to, so he could call her dramatic later, so he could tell people she had overreacted. She simply looked at her mother, and something in her expression made Carol take a half step back, as though she already sensed what was coming. Danielle opened her mouth, and one sentence came out. It was short. It was final. And it ended the conversation for good. To understand why that single sentence carried the weight it did, you have to go back 14 years, to a hospital hallway where a 19-year-old girl sat alone, waiting for a doctor to tell her whether her father was going to survive the night. Marcus Cole had raised Danielle mostly on his own after her parents' first marriage fell apart when she was 7. He worked long hours as a contractor, came home smelling like sawdust and coffee, and never once let Danielle believe that being raised by a tired, imperfect single father made her love any less complete. Carol had remarried by then, moved 2 states away with a man named Gerald Whitfield, and visits with Danielle had grown thin, reduced to holiday phone calls and the occasional weekend that always seemed to get rescheduled. When Marcus died of a sudden heart attack at 51, Danielle was left with 2 things that mattered more than anything else in the world: his life insurance policy, and the last conversation they'd had, 3 days before he collapsed, in which he told her that whatever she built with that money, she should build it for herself, and never let anyone talk her out of what was hers. She didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. She would understand it completely, years later, standing in her own living room being told to give it all away. 1819, grief made the world feel unstable, but that conversation became an anchor she returned to again and again, especially in the years that followed, when Carol re-entered her life with Gerald already installed as a permanent fixture beside her. Carol had married Gerald less than 2 years after Marcus's funeral, a fact that Danielle noticed but never said out loud. Not wanting to be the daughter who couldn't let her mother move on, Gerald arrived with a daughter of his own from a previous marriage, a girl named Vanessa Whitfield, 3 years younger than Danielle, bright, charming, and used to being the center of any room she walked into. From the beginning, family gatherings quietly reorganized themselves around Vanessa. Christmas moved to accommodate her school schedule. Birthdays that had once belonged to Danielle alone became shared celebrations, then eventually Vanessa's celebrations with Danielle as a guest. Danielle told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things didn't matter, for a long time, because saying otherwise felt like betraying the little bit of family she had left. Those early years after Carol left were harder than Danielle ever let anyone see. Marcus worked construction contracts across 3 counties, sometimes leaving before sunrise and returning long after Danielle had finished her homework alone at the kitchen table. He never complained about it, never once suggested that raising a daughter by himself was a burden he resented, even on the nights when money was tight and the refrigerator held less than either of them would have liked. What he gave Danielle instead of ease was consistency, the same bedtime every night, the same insistence that she finish every assignment before turning on the television, the same quiet reminder every single morning that she belonged to herself first and to anyone else second. Danielle did not fully appreciate that lesson until she was much older, and by then, it had already shaped nearly every decision she made. Carol's visits during those years were infrequent, and when they happened, they carried a strange formality, as though Carol were meeting a niece rather than the daughter she had given birth to. Danielle remembered sitting across from her mother in restaurant booths, answering polite questions about school and friends, watching Carol check her watch more than once during meals that never seemed to last as long as Danielle wanted them to. She never said this bothered her, not to Marcus, not to anyone, because even as a child she sensed that naming the hurt out loud would only make it heavier to carry. It was easier to tell herself that her mother was simply busy building a new life, and that busyness, not distance, explained the growing space between them. When Carol married Gerald Whitfield, the wedding took place out of state, and Danielle, then 21 and newly grieving her father who had passed only 2 years earlier, attended more out of obligation than desire. She remembered standing at the edge of the reception, watching Gerald's daughter Vanessa, 18 at the time, laugh easily among Carol's side of the family, already folded seamlessly into a group of relatives Danielle herself had never fully belonged to. It struck her, even then, could assemble itself around a shared history that did not include her, and how naturally everyone else seemed to accept that arrangement as simply the way things were now. The years that followed cemented a pattern Danielle eventually stopped questioning out loud. Thanksgiving moved permanently to Gerald's sister's house, a location Danielle had never been invited to before Carol's remarriage. Christmas mornings, once a small, quiet tradition Danielle remembered fondly from childhood, became larger, louder gatherings built around Vanessa's college friends and Gerald's extended family, with Danielle attending as a guest among people who mostly knew her only as Carol's daughter from before, a phrase she overheard more than once, spoken without malice but landing with weight all the same. She never confronted Carol about any of it directly. Confrontation felt, at the time, like a risk she wasn't willing to take with the only parent she had left. Vanessa, for her part, never seemed to notice the imbalance, or if she did, she never acknowledged it. She was warm toward Danielle in the surface way people are warm toward relatives they see only a few times a year, complimenting her outfits, asking occasional questions about her job, never quite crossing into anything resembling real closeness. Gerald was different, that he carried a specific kind of politeness toward Danielle that always felt, to her, like a performance for Carol's benefit rather than genuine interest, punctuated by comments that implied, without ever directly stating, that Danielle's independence made her somehow harder to reach, harder to love, harder to fully welcome into the family he had built with her mother. By the time Danielle turned 29, she had built a career as a real estate appraiser, methodical and sharp-eyed, the kind of person who could walk into a property and see exactly what it was worth before anyone told her the asking price. She used the life insurance payout from her father, money she had kept untouched for a decade out of something between grief and reverence, to buy an apartment outright. $750,000, paid in full, no mortgage, no co-signer, nothing tying it to anyone but her. It was the single most significant financial decision of her life, and it was also, though she rarely said this out loud, the closest she had ever come to feeling like her father was still present in a room with her. Every wall of that apartment felt like it belonged to both of them. Vanessa's life took a different shape. She drifted through 2 college attempts without finishing either, worked a series of jobs that never seemed to last more than a year, and relied heavily on Gerald whenever things got difficult, which was often. Gerald never seemed to mind that. If anything, he treated Vanessa's dependence on him as proof of his own devotion as a father, a devotion he sometimes implied, without ever directly saying it, that Danielle had somehow denied her own mother by being too independent, too closed off, too much like the father who raised her. Carol rarely defended Danielle in these moments. Over the years, she had grown quieter around Gerald, deferential in a way that Danielle found difficult to watch, though she never fully understood why her mother had changed so much. When Vanessa announced she was pregnant, the family reacted the way families often do to unexpected news, with a mixture of concern and forced optimism, though underneath the surface there was real uncertainty about how a woman with no stable job and no savings was going to support a child. Gerald, predictably, positioned himself as the solution. And then, within weeks, in conversations Danielle wasn't originally part of, an idea took shape that Gerald began repeating as though it had always been obvious. The apartment. Danielle's apartment, the one paid for entirely by Marcus Cole's life insurance. Gerald began telling people, casually, that the baby would be raised there, that it only made sense, that Danielle, single and childless, surely didn't need all that space to herself. Renee Castillo had known Danielle since college, long before Carol remarried, long before Vanessa or Gerald ever entered the picture, and over the years she had become something closer to family than most of Danielle's actual relatives. Renee had watched the slow, uneven shift in Danielle's family dynamic from the outside, Close enough to see the details Danielle herself sometimes minimized, but distant enough to name them plainly when Danielle couldn't. It was Renee who had pointed out, years earlier, that Danielle always seemed to shrink slightly whenever Gerald walked into a room, and it was Renee who had gently suggested, more than once, that Carol's guilt over the divorce seemed to be steering far more of the family's decisions than anyone in the family was willing to admit out loud. When Renee first heard the rumor about the apartment, she didn't dismiss it the way Danielle initially had. She had seen this family's pattern too many times before, small requests that grew into larger ones, guilt deployed carefully and often, always aimed in the same direction. Renee encouraged Danielle to take the rumor seriously immediately, to start asking questions before Gerald and Carol had the chance to formalize their request into something harder to walk back. That it was this early push from Renee that led Danielle to first mention the situation to Howard Lynn weeks before the confrontation actually occurred, giving her a head start she wouldn't fully appreciate until the supplementary trust document surfaced and the timeline of her own preparation suddenly mattered a great deal. Vanessa's financial troubles had been building for longer than most of the family realized. She had left her most recent job, a marketing coordinator position she'd held for just under a year, months before announcing her pregnancy, citing burnout, though Danielle later learned from Renee that the departure had actually followed a dispute over missed deadlines. Tyler Whitfield, Vanessa's boyfriend and the baby's father, worked inconsistent hours as a freelance contractor, income that fluctuated month to month and rarely covered more than the basics. Between the two of them, savings were minimal, and the apartment they rented together was already behind on payments by the time Vanessa's pregnancy became public knowledge within the family. Gerald had quietly covered the shortfall twice already, a fact Danielle wouldn't learn until much later, and each time, the rescue had come without any real conversation about how the pattern might change going forward. It was around this time that a strange detail surfaced, one that would occupy Danielle's attention for several days before ultimately leading nowhere. Renee mentioned, almost in passing, that Gerald had been asking mutual acquaintances questions about how property transfers worked between family members, specifically what documentation would be required and how quickly a deed could legally change hands. At first, this seemed to confirm exactly what Danielle feared, that Gerald intended to pursue the apartment through some kind of legal maneuvering if she refused to hand it over voluntarily. Danielle spent an anxious weekend convinced that Gerald might attempt something more aggressive than a family conversation, perhaps even explore whether Carol, as Danielle's mother, held any residual legal claim to property purchased with an inheritance that had technically passed through the family line. When Danielle raised this concern with Howard Lynn during their first meeting, he explained patiently that no such claim existed, that the apartment was solely and irrevocably Danielle's under both the original purchase agreement and basic inheritance law, regardless of any research Gerald might be conducting. The property questions, Howard suggested, were more likely simple bluster, an attempt by Gerald to sound informed and authoritative during arguments rather than any real legal strategy. This turned out to be accurate. Gerald, as it happened, had no actual plan beyond persistent pressure and repeated appeals to guilt, and the rumors of legal research amounted to little more than a handful of vague questions he'd asked a neighbor who worked in property management, questions that led nowhere and changed nothing about the actual situation Danielle was facing. Danielle first heard the rumor from her best friend, Renee Castillo, who had heard it secondhand from a cousin who had heard it from Carol herself. At first, Danielle assumed it was an exaggeration, a family story stretched past recognition the way these things sometimes are. But then Carol called, her voice unusually formal, asking if Danielle had a few minutes to talk about something important. That was the first conversation. It ended with Danielle politely declining, assuming the matter closed. It was not closed. 2 weeks later, Gerald and Carol arrived unannounced at her apartment, the one from the opening of this story, and delivered their ultimatum standing in her own living room, as though the space itself had never truly belonged to her at all. Before we go further into what happened next, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, back to Danielle, standing in her living room, having just delivered the sentence that ended the conversation, though not the story. What she said in that moment will come later, once you understand exactly what she was responding to, and exactly what she had discovered only days before her mother and stepfather showed up demanding she hand over the one thing her father had left her. The confrontation that day did not begin the way most family disagreements begin, with raised voices or slammed doors. It began with Carol setting a folder of printed apartment listings on Danielle's kitchen counter, as though she had come prepared to negotiate rather than to ask. Gerald did most of the talking. That he explained, in the tone of a man delivering an obvious solution to an obvious problem, that Danielle living alone in a property worth $750,000 while her pregnant stepsister faced housing insecurity was, in his words, a failure of family values. Danielle listened without interrupting, watching her mother's face for some sign of disagreement that never came. When Gerald finished, he told her she had 1 week to begin the transfer process. As though the timeline itself made the request more reasonable. Danielle asked, calmly, why the responsibility fell to her specifically, rather than to Gerald, who had raised Vanessa and presumably had resources of his own. Gerald's expression shifted, the practiced calm slipping for a moment into something closer to irritation. He said that Danielle had always been distant from the family, that she had inherited money she never truly earned, and that giving it toward her sister's child was the least she could do to finally act like she belonged to this family instead of standing apart from it the way she always had. Carol said nothing to correct him. Danielle noted that silence carefully, filed it away the way she filed away every uneven floorboard and cracked foundation in the properties she assessed for a living. Recognizing structural weakness long before anyone else in the room did. It was Carol's next comment that shifted the entire conversation, though no one in the room fully understood it at the time except Carol herself. Attempting to soften Gerald's harsh framing, Carol said quietly that Danielle should consider what her father would have wanted, that Marcus would have wanted his daughter to be generous with family. The words themselves were unremarkable, the kind of sentiment people say at moments like these without thinking too hard about them, but Danielle noticed something in her mother's face as she said it, a flicker of something closer to guilt than sentiment, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Danielle had spent her entire adult life reading the fine print other people missed, and in that instant, something in her told her that sentence was not as simple as it sounded. Danielle told them she needed time to think, which was not entirely true, since her decision had already formed days earlier, but she wanted the room to breathe before she said anything more. Gerald pushed, reminding her of the 1-week deadline as though repetition alone might change her answer. Carol said little else, her earlier composure now visibly cracking at the edges, though she offered no explanation for it. When they finally left, Danielle sat alone in the apartment that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a battlefield, replaying her mother's comment about her father again and again, until the unease in her chest became something she could no longer ignore. The following morning, Danielle called Renee Castillo, the only person who had watched this entire family dynamic unfold from the outside for over a decade without ever pretending it was normal. Renee listened to the full account of the confrontation, then asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of Danielle's mind since the moment Carol mentioned her father: why would Carol bring up Marcus at all, in a conversation that had nothing to do with him, unless something about him was still unresolved in a way Danielle didn't know about? Danielle didn't have an answer. But she had a lawyer, Howard Lynn, who had helped her close on the apartment years earlier, and she decided it was time to ask him a question she had never thought to ask before. Danielle met Howard Lynn at his office 2 days after the confrontation, requesting something specific: the complete original paperwork from her father's estate, not the summary she had been given at 19, but every document, every filing, everything that had been processed when Marcus Cole's life insurance and assets were settled. Howard explained that pulling the full archived file would take some time, since the original estate attorney who handled Marcus's affairs had retired nearly a decade earlier, and the physical records had since been transferred to an off-site storage facility shared by several small firms. Danielle waited 2 additional days, checking her phone constantly, replaying her mother's comment about her father over and over, unable to shake the feeling that something important had been sitting untouched for years without her knowledge. When Howard finally called her back into his office, he had a thick folder spread across his desk, considerably larger than the summary packet Danielle remembered receiving as a 19-year-old, still raw with grief and unequipped to fully understand the legal weight of what she was signing at the time. Howard walked her through the documents chronologically: the initial death certificate, the probate filing, the standard distribution of assets. Danielle recognized most of it, having reviewed similar filings countless times in her own career, though seeing her father's name attached to each page struck her differently than any professional file ever had. That it was somewhere near the bottom of the folder that Howard paused on a page Danielle had never seen before, a supplementary trust document filed alongside the primary estate paperwork, one that had apparently never been formally delivered to her, sealed under conditions tied to a future date that, as it turned out, had already passed years earlier without anyone informing her it existed. Howard explained that the supplementary filing had likely been overlooked due to a clerical inconsistency common in estates handled before digital record keeping became standard practice. where trust documents requiring conditional release were sometimes separated from the primary estate file and never properly flagged for follow-up once their release conditions were met, that he apologized on behalf of the profession broadly, acknowledging that this kind of oversight, while rare, was not unheard of, especially in cases where the original attorney retired or the firm changed hands before every conditional document had been resolved. Danielle appreciated the explanation, but it did little to soften the strange, disorienting feeling of learning that a message from her father had been sitting, sealed and waiting, for more than a decade while she lived her entire adult life without knowing it existed. Howard explained, carefully, that the supplementary document was a personal letter, written by Marcus Cole himself, held in trust with instructions that it only be released to Danielle upon specific conditions the original filing lawyer, long since retired, had apparently never triggered due to an administrative oversight. Danielle sat across from Howard's desk, her hands unusually still, as he explained that the letter had been sitting untouched in an inactive estate file for over a decade. She asked him, quietly, if he could open it now. Howard hesitated only briefly before agreeing that as her legal counsel, and given that the release condition tied to time had long since passed, there was no remaining reason to withhold it any further. The letter, when Howard finally read portions of it aloud, was not what Danielle expected. It was not sentimental in the way she had imagined a father's final words might be. It was precise, almost clinical, written by a man who appeared to have known something was wrong in his marriage long before it ended. Marcus wrote that he had learned, shortly before his death, that Carol had been planning to leave him, and that the relationship she was leaving him for had already begun before their divorce was finalized. That he did not name Gerald directly in the portion Howard read first, but the timeline he described lined up, almost exactly, with when Carol and Gerald had married less than 2 years after his funeral. Marcus's letter explained that he had structured the life insurance and the eventual apartment purchase specifically to ensure it could never be pressured away from Danielle by anyone connected to that new relationship, anyone who might one day try to convince her, through guilt or family obligation, to give away the one thing that was truly hers. That he wrote that he suspected, even then, that Carol's new family might eventually try to claim some part of what he was leaving behind, and he wanted Danielle to have, in writing, in his own words, permission to say no without guilt, without hesitation, and without needing anyone else's approval to protect what belonged to her. There was no remaining reason to withhold it any further. The letter, when Howard finally read portions of it aloud, was not what Danielle expected. It was not sentimental in the way she had imagined a father's final words might be. It was precise, almost clinical, written by a man who appeared to have known something was wrong in his marriage long before it ended. Marcus wrote that he had learned, shortly before his death, that Carol had been planning to leave him, and that the relationship she was leaving him for had already begun before their divorce was finalized. That he did not name Gerald directly in the portion Howard read first, but the timeline he described lined up, almost exactly, with when Carol and Gerald had married less than 2 years after his funeral. Marcus's letter explained that he had structured the life insurance and the eventual apartment purchase specifically to ensure it could never be pressured away from Danielle by anyone connected to that new relationship, anyone who might one day try to convince her, through guilt or family obligation, to give away the one thing that was truly hers. That he wrote that he suspected, even then, that Carol's new family might eventually try to claim some part of what he was leaving behind, and he wanted Danielle to have, in writing, in his own words, permission to say no without guilt, without hesitation, and without needing anyone else's approval to protect what belonged to her. Howard continued reading, and the letter grew more personal in its final pages, less concerned with legal structure and more concerned with what Marcus actually wanted his daughter to understand about herself. He wrote that he had watched her grow into someone careful, someone who thought things through, someone who would likely spend years second-guessing whether she deserved to keep something for herself when other people asked her to give it away. That he told her that she did deserve it, that wanting to hold on to something built from love and loss was not selfishness, and that if anyone ever tried to convince her otherwise, using words like family or obligation or sacrifice, she should remember that he had seen this exact possibility coming, long before she ever would, and had done everything within his power to make sure she would never have to face it without support. Danielle read the final lines herself, taking the page gently from Howard's hands, her father's handwriting steady. Even in a moment that must have been anything but steady for him, the letter ended simply, without dramatic flourish, the way Marcus had always spoken in life, direct and unadorned. That he told her he loved her, that he was proud of the person she was becoming even at 19, and that whatever she chose to do with what he left her, he trusted her judgment completely. Danielle sat with that final line for a long moment, feeling, for the first time since the confrontation began, something closer to grief than anger, a fresh wave of missing her father that 14 years had not fully dulled. Howard gave her space, quietly stepping out of his own office to let her sit alone with the letter for a few minutes before returning with copies prepared for her to take home. He explained again, gently, that regardless of the emotional weight of what she had just read, the legal structure behind it was airtight, drafted with unusual precision for an estate of that size and era, evidence that Marcus had likely consulted more carefully with his original attorney than most people do when facing their own mortality. Danielle thanked him, gathered the folder, and left his office that afternoon carrying something heavier and lighter at the same time, the full weight of a truth she hadn't asked for, and the strange relief of finally understanding a piece of her life that had never made sense until that moment. Danielle sat in Howard's office for a long time after he finished reading, turning over more than a decade of quiet family dynamics in her mind, understanding now why Carol had always seemed uneasy whenever Marcus came up in conversation, why family gatherings had reorganized so completely around Gerald's daughter, why Carol had never once defended Danielle when Gerald implied she owed the family more than she had already given. It wasn't distance that had shaped their relationship all these years. It was guilt, carefully hidden guilt, that Carol had apparently carried since before Marcus even passed away, guilt she had never once acknowledged directly to the daughter she left standing on the outside of her new family for over a decade. In the days between reading her father's letter and returning to face Carol and Gerald a final time, Danielle found herself moving through her normal routine with an unfamiliar sense of detachment, as though she were appraising her own life from the outside the way she appraised properties for strangers. She went to work, walked through client homes, measured square footage and noted structural details, all while carrying the weight of a decision that had, in truth, already been made the moment Howard finished reading her father's words aloud. What remained wasn't uncertainty about what she would say. It was the harder work of preparing herself emotionally to say it, knowing that once spoken, it could not be softened or taken back. She called Renee twice that week, not for advice this time, but simply to talk through the strange grief resurfacing alongside the anger, the particular ache of missing a father who had been gone for 14 years but who suddenly felt, through his own handwriting, more present than he had in a long time. Renee listened, as she always had, offering neither judgment nor pressure, simply the steady presence of someone who had watched this entire story unfold from its earliest chapters and understood exactly what this moment cost Danielle, even as it also, in its own complicated way, gave something back to her that she hadn't realized she'd lost. Danielle also found herself thinking, more than once that week, about what her answer would mean for Vanessa, a person she genuinely believed had been more misled than malicious throughout the entire ordeal. She did not want her decision to read as punishment aimed at an unborn child or the woman carrying it, and she spent real time considering how to separate the boundaries she intended to hold from any cruelty toward Vanessa specifically. It was this careful distinction, worked out quietly over several sleepless nights, that would later shape the smaller, more human gesture she extended to Vanessa once the dust from the confrontation had settled. Danielle asked Howard whether the letter had any legal weight beyond its emotional content, and Howard confirmed that it did. The trust document explicitly stated that the apartment, purchased using the life insurance proceeds, could never be transferred, gifted, or signed over to any stepfamily member by marriage, a condition legally binding regardless of Danielle's personal wishes. In other words, even if Danielle had wanted to give the apartment to Vanessa, the structure of her father's trust would have prevented it outright. Marcus had not simply hoped his daughter would hold her ground, that he had built a legal wall around the possibility that she might one day be pressured into giving it up, protecting her from a future he seemed to have anticipated with unsettling clarity. Howard also flagged something else buried in the trust language, a clause requiring the firm to formally notify Danielle of the letter's existence once its release conditions had lapsed, a notification that had simply never occurred due to the earlier attorney's retirement and the resulting gap in case management. He apologized again for the oversight, explaining that he intended to file the necessary paperwork correcting the estate's records so that, going forward, there would be no ambiguity about the trust's terms or the letter's authenticity, should either Carol or Gerald ever attempt to challenge its validity. Danielle appreciated the thoroughness, recognizing in Howard the same careful, unhurried precision her father had apparently insisted upon when the original documents were drafted years earlier. Danielle left Howard's office that afternoon carrying more than paperwork. She carried the full shape of a story that had been hidden from her for 14 years, one that reframed every strained holiday, every reorganized birthday, every moment Carol had gone quiet instead of standing up for her. She did not call her mother immediately. She let the information settle for 2 full days, giving herself time to decide not what she would say, because she already knew that, but how she wanted to say it. When Carol and Gerald returned at the end of the week, expecting either a signature or an argument, Danielle had already decided to give them neither. Gerald arrived first this time, visibly impatient, asking whether Danielle had reached a decision, his tone suggesting he expected the answer to already be in his favor. Carol trailed slightly behind him, and Danielle noticed immediately that her mother would not fully meet her eyes, a small detail that confirmed everything Howard's file had revealed. Danielle set a folder on the kitchen counter, the same counter where Carol had once laid out apartment listings as though the decision belonged to someone other than Danielle. Inside the folder was a copy of the trust document, along with a photocopy of the letter Howard had read aloud 2 days earlier, the one Marcus had written and sealed away long before either Gerald. Before that final confrontation, though, there had been an earlier dinner, one that deserves its own place in this story, because it was there that the full weight of the family's expectations first became impossible for Danielle to ignore. Carol had organized a Sunday dinner at Gerald's sister's house, the same house that had hosted Thanksgiving for years, and Danielle arrived expecting a normal, if slightly tense, family gathering. Instead, she found herself seated at a table where the conversation had clearly been planned in advance, where Gerald steered every topic, gently but persistently, back toward Vanessa's pregnancy and the housing difficulties she and Tyler were facing. Gerald spoke at length about family responsibility, about how people who had been given advantages in life owed something back to those who hadn't been so fortunate, phrasing his argument carefully enough that he never directly named Danielle's apartment, though everyone at the table understood exactly what he meant. Vanessa said little during this portion of the dinner, occasionally glancing toward Danielle with an expression that seemed less like entitlement and more like discomfort, though Danielle couldn't be certain at the time whether that discomfort came from guilt or simply from being at the center of a conversation she hadn't fully agreed to have in public. That it was Carol who finally said it outright, midway through dessert. Asking Danielle directly whether she had thought any more about helping her sister with a place to raise the baby, the word sister landed strangely in Danielle's ears, a term Carol had never used consistently over the years, deployed now with obvious intention, meant to collapse 14 years of distance into a single, convenient word that implied an obligation Danielle had never actually agreed to. Danielle told them, as gently as she could manage in front of extended family, that the apartment was not something she was prepared to discuss that evening, that it was a significant financial decision requiring more thought than a dinner conversation allowed. Gerald did not accept that answer easily. He pointed out, his voice rising slightly, that Danielle had inherited the apartment essentially for free, that she had never had to work for it the way other people worked for their homes, and that treating it as some untouchable, sacred possession seemed, in his words, selfish given the circumstances. The table went quiet. Danielle felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment but from something closer to anger, carefully controlled anger, the kind she had learned from years of appraising properties owned by people who mistreated the professionals working for them and never once raised her voice in response. She told Gerald, evenly, that the money behind that apartment had come from her father's death, and that reducing it to something she hadn't worked for erased exactly what it represented to her. The dinner ended shortly afterward, with an uncomfortable silence settling over the table that no one quite knew how to break. Carol walked Danielle to her car afterward, apologizing vaguely for Gerald's bluntness without actually disagreeing with the substance of what he'd said, and it was in that walk to the car, that half-hearted, incomplete apology, that Danielle first began to suspect her mother's allegiance in this matter had already been decided long before that dinner had even begun. She drove home that night turning the entire conversation over in her mind, and it was in the days immediately following that dinner that Gerald and Carol arrived at her apartment to deliver their formal one-week ultimatum, the confrontation that opened this story. Now, returning to the moment the truth finally surfaced, Gerald reached for the folder first, scanning it with visible confusion, asking what any of this had to do with the conversation. Carol, however, had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on her ex-husband's handwriting, recognizing it instantly even after all these years. Danielle watched her mother read the letter in real time, watched the exact moment Carol reached the paragraph describing the affair that had begun before their divorce was finalized, watched the color drain slowly from her face as 14 years of carefully maintained silence collapsed in the space of a single page. Gerald, still not fully understanding what he was looking at, asked Carol directly whether any of it was true. Carol did not answer him immediately. She looked instead at Danielle, and for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, there was no performance in her expression, no rehearsed calm, only the raw discomfort of being seen clearly after years of not being seen at all. She admitted, quietly, that the timeline in the letter was accurate, that her relationship with Gerald had, in fact, begun before Marcus passed away, though she insisted it had never been the reason for his death, only a truth she had buried. Because facing it meant facing exactly the kind of daughter she had become in the process, the kind who reorganized her family around guilt rather than honesty. Gerald's reaction shifted the room in a different direction. Not dismantle the one lasting piece of him she had left in order to comfort people who had spent over a decade making her feel like an outsider in her own family. She told Gerald that his daughter's situation, while difficult, was not Danielle's responsibility to solve with an inheritance meant to protect her from precisely this kind of pressure, and she told her mother, more quietly than anything else she said that day, that she finally understood why Carol had never been able to look her fully in the eye whenever Marcus's name came up. The room did not erupt into shouting the way Gerald perhaps expected it to. Instead, it fell into the kind of silence that follows something irreversible, a silence Danielle recognized from every difficult appraisal she had ever delivered, the moment a client finally understood the truth about something they had hoped was worth more than it actually was. Gerald left first, still visibly unable to process that his plan had unraveled so completely, taking with him none of the paperwork Danielle had laid out, as though refusing to touch it might undo what it had already revealed. Carol lingered a moment longer, staring at the folder on the counter, before finally following him out without another word passing between mother and daughter. In the weeks that followed, the fallout moved through the family the way these things always do, quietly at first, then unmistakably. Carol and Gerald's marriage, already strained by years of accumulated tension neither had ever addressed directly, began to visibly fracture once the secret Carol had buried for over a decade became something that could no longer be unspoken within the family. Gerald, it turned out, had known nothing about the true timeline of his own relationship with Carol, having believed for years that their romance began cleanly after her divorce from Marcus was finalized, not before. Learning otherwise, and learning it in front of Danielle rather than privately, wounded him in a way that had nothing to do with the apartment and everything to do with the foundation of his own marriage. Gerald and Carol's arguments in the weeks that followed reportedly grew louder and more frequent, according to what Renee heard through the family's wider circle of acquaintances, though Danielle herself remained largely outside the direct fallout, having said what she needed to say and stepped back from the day-to-day drama unfolding between her mother and stepfather. Carol, for her part, seemed to move through those weeks with a kind of exhausted honesty she had avoided for over a decade, finally answering Gerald's questions about the affair's true timeline without the careful evasions she had relied on for so long. Whether their marriage would survive that reckoning remained uncertain for months, and even Danielle, watching from a careful distance, found herself uncertain whether she hoped it would or wouldn't. What became clear, regardless of the marriage's ultimate fate, was that the family's center of gravity had shifted permanently. Gerald's authority within the household, once unquestioned, had eroded considerably once his daughter Vanessa began quietly questioning the version of events he had always presented as fact. Carol, meanwhile, found herself in the unfamiliar position of being the one who owed answers rather than the one demanding them, a reversal that Danielle noticed with a complicated mixture of vindication and sadness, neither emotion fully overriding the other. Vanessa, for her part, had never been told the full history behind Marcus and Carol's divorce, and when she eventually learned it, secondhand and incomplete, she reached out to Danielle directly for the first time in years, not to argue about the apartment, but to apologize for repeating demands she had never fully understood the context of. Danielle did not immediately forgive everything that had happened, nor did she pretend the years of quiet exclusion had never occurred, but she agreed to speak with Vanessa, and the two of them met at a small coffee shop neither had been to before. Neutral ground that belonged to neither family history nor the tension that now surrounded it. Vanessa arrived visibly nervous, and the conversation began slowly, both women unsure how honest to be with each other after years of relating only through the filtered lens of family gatherings and second-hand updates. It was Vanessa who finally broke the surface politeness, admitting that she had spent the last several weeks replaying every conversation she'd ever had with her father about Danielle, realizing how one-sided and incomplete his version of their family history had always been. Vanessa explained that she had genuinely believed, based entirely on what Gerald told her, that the apartment situation was simply a family helping a struggling relative, with no knowledge of the deeper history tied to Marcus's trust or Carol's past. She had never been told that Carol's relationship with Gerald began before the divorce, never known that Marcus had specifically structured his estate to prevent exactly the kind of pressure her father had applied. Hearing it now, secondhand and incomplete as it was, reframed years of her own upbringing, and she admitted, quietly, that it was strange to realize her father might not have been entirely honest with her either, not just with Danielle. Danielle listened without interrupting, recognizing in Vanessa's discomfort something she herself had carried for years, the particular disorientation of learning that a story you'd been told your whole life wasn't the full story after all. She did not offer to give up the apartment. That was never going to change, and she said so plainly, without apology, making clear that the conversation they were having was not a negotiation. But she did offer something smaller and more human, help finding an affordable place of her own, a connection to a colleague who managed rental properties, a gesture that cost Danielle nothing legally but meant something personally, proof that holding a boundary and holding compassion were not mutually exclusive after all. Vanessa accepted the offer, and in the months that followed, she and Tyler moved into a modest 2-bedroom unit across town, smaller than the life Gerald had once imagined for them, but stable, and entirely their own. Tyler, for his part, remained largely outside the family drama, focused on preparing for the baby's arrival, though even he later admitted to Danielle, during one brief conversation, that Gerald's insistence on the apartment had always struck him as an odd solution to a problem that had far more practical, far less complicated answers available. Carol reached out to Danielle several times in the months following the confrontation, and Danielle answered, though carefully, unwilling to rebuild a relationship on the same foundation of avoidance that had defined it for over a decade. Their conversations were slow, often uncomfortable, filled with long pauses where neither woman quite knew how to bridge 14 years of unspoken history. Carol admitted, eventually, that she had allowed guilt to shape nearly every decision she made regarding Danielle since the divorce, overcompensating with Vanessa not out of greater love, but out of an inability to face what she had done to the marriage, and by extension, to the daughter caught in its aftermath. Danielle did not offer immediate forgiveness. She offered instead a willingness to keep talking, which, for two people who had spent over a decade barely speaking honestly at all, felt like its own kind of progress. Renee visited often during those months, and one evening, sitting together in the living room where the entire confrontation had first begun, she asked Danielle whether she regretted any part of how things had unfolded, whether some quieter, more accommodating version of herself might have found a way to keep the peace without ever opening her father's letter at all. Danielle considered the question seriously before answering. She admitted that there had been moments, in the immediate aftermath, when the silence between herself and Carol felt unbearable, when she wondered whether honesty had cost her more than it had given back, but she also knew, with a certainty she hadn't possessed before any of this began, that a peace built on hidden guilt and unspoken debts had never truly been peace at all, only a fragile agreement to keep looking away. Months later, Danielle still lived in the apartment her father had left her. The walls around her carrying a different weight now than they had before the letter surfaced. She understood, in a way she hadn't fully understood at 29, that Marcus had not simply left her money. He had left her a boundary, built years in advance, protecting a version of her future he could not have known the details of, but somehow anticipated the shape of anyway. Carol and Danielle's relationship remained complicated, rebuilding slowly, in the careful, uneven way relationships rebuild after a decade of unspoken guilt finally comes into the light. Gerald, for his part, remained mostly absent from Danielle's life afterward, unwilling or unable to acknowledge the role his own demands had played in unraveling what remained of his marriage to Carol. There was something fitting, Danielle often thought afterward, in the fact that her entire career had trained her to see the true worth of a property beneath whatever price someone else wanted to assign. She had spent over a decade walking into homes and looking past fresh paint and staged furniture, past the stories sellers told to justify their asking price, straight to the foundation, the wiring, the bones of the place that actually determined what something was worth. She had never once, in all those years, thought to apply that same scrutiny to her own family, to the stories she had been told about who deserved what and why, until the moment her father's letter forced her to look past the surface of her own life the way she had always looked past the surface of other people's houses. She thought, too, about the years she had spent quietly discounting her own discomfort, telling herself that reorganized holidays and half-hearted birthday celebrations were simply the ordinary friction of blended families, nothing worth naming, nothing worth defending against. She understood now that her father had seen something she hadn't been ready to see at 19, that the quiet erosion of her place within the family had never been accidental, and that his letter had been, in its own way, an appraisal of its own, an honest account of what was actually happening beneath the surface, delivered 14 years later than either of them would have wanted, but delivered all the same. What stays with anyone who hears this story is not simply the confrontation in the living room, or the letter that had waited 14 years to be read, but the quieter question underneath all of it. How many families operate on unspoken debts, favors extended out of guilt rather than honesty, boundaries assumed to be flexible simply because no one has ever tested them out loud? Danielle tested hers, not out of cruelty, but because her father had given her permission to, in writing, long before either of them knew exactly when that permission would be needed. Would you have signed the deed over to keep the peace, or would you have opened your father's letter first, the way Danielle did, and let the truth decide the answer for you? If this story moved you, if you found yourself imagining what you would have done standing in Danielle's living room, let us know in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us honestly, would you have held the line the way she did, or would the pressure of family have worn you down before the truth ever had the chance to come out? That if you want more stories like this one, real family conflicts, hidden histories, and the quiet decisions that end up changing everything, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more stories exactly like Danielle's waiting for you, and you will not want to miss a single one of them.